Let's cross over to Gavin Thompson-Wise. He's the election data manager at the U.S. Vote Foundation. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. What are you hearing in terms of how it's going around the country so far?
Thank you for having me. What I'm hearing is pretty similar to what you're hearing, that through the early vote and through the mail-in absentee ballots, we are looking at really possibly higher than ever before turnout, certainly in that phase of voting, and we could be looking at what could be a 100-year turnout, as some are saying now. How many we will see on today, on Election Day, that's the big question I think that we're all waiting to find out.
All waiting to find out how big a turnout it actually is. And the caricature we've heard is that the Democrats like to vote early and the Republicans like to vote on the day. Is that what your numbers find?
I think that's the prevailing wisdom. However, there's a number of notable exceptions to that as well. But if that does hold true, I think that's where you're going to see some interesting things with regards to the results, for example. When some of the early results are released after the close of polls tonight, I think 7, 8 o'clock on some of these states like Florida, North Carolina, etc., they will be reporting on the early voting totals right away, and those mail ballot totals right away, because they have the permission to count them earlier. So in that respect, I think we'll see, if that theory holds true, we could see Democrats with a little bit of an edge, and that number may go down over the evening as the election day returns come in. Now, the opposite may be true in a state like Pennsylvania, which doesn't have the ability to count early. So we may see the opposite hold true there. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Have to wait and see. And do you get... have you ever dealt with anything like this before? What does it tell you? 100 million people have already voted. What does it tell you when it comes to how those ballots will be counted? We've seen challenges in lots of areas, in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, Wisconsin. Is this going to play out for days, weeks, months?
It very well could. I think that it really depends on what happens, again, with those early states that close. If we see that there perhaps isn't a path to the presidency for the current president, as some have predicted, then we will see a lot of this pressure for counting those other ballots in some of those other states that come in later. A lot of that pressure will just disappear. However, if the presidency is very much still in question after some of those early states come in, then, as it goes days and days, that's when, we will see that pressure applied. And that's when it will become, I don't want to say another Florida 2000, but, it will be a sort of uncharted territory in this country, for sure.
Gavin Thompson-Wise, I guess, forgive us for trying to read the tea leaves here. We're seeing in some of those key swing states, people have voted, it's variable just to how much they've voted early. I'm looking at Pennsylvania, 40% of registered voters, if I'm correct, and places like Michigan and Ohio, 60%. Does that say anything about the way the actual vote is going to go?
We would have to assume that it's the same electorate voting. It's just people are choosing to cast their ballots in a different way. For example, in Pennsylvania, the option to cast votes by mail wasn't really there in the same manner as it is this year. So that's why you see such high numbers. In other states like Florida, they had a tradition of voting by mail. So I think that this is just telling you that people, I think, made up their minds much earlier this year. I think it's also telling you that people were a little uncertain about how they would be able to cast a vote on Election Day. With all of the COVID-19 restrictions and what have you, would they be able to just go to their regular polling station like normal and cast a ballot? And would they feel safe doing it? And because of that, together with maybe an electorate that largely did, make up its mind pretty early this election, it caused a lot of people to just simply vote early, and that's why we see such high numbers across the board.
And again, there's that big difference between those who went to early voting centers or to drop boxes or who sent their ballots through the post. And, well, there are questions, particularly with those mail-in ballots.
Yeah, I mean, voters had a number of ways to cast their ballots, as you just mentioned, and there is some questions about those who cast them via the Postal Service. There are reports that the Postal Service was maybe a bit slower this year, especially during the last week. And there is a question of whether or not ballots in some states postmarked by today, by Election Day, will be counted after. In many states, in several states, there are provisions, in some up to, I think, California, maybe 17 days or so. They can arrive as long as they're postmarked on the day. In others, like Pennsylvania, they've just changed the law to allow votes to come in up to Friday, as long as they were postmarked today. However, as you may have heard on the news, the Supreme Court has sort of left the room open for, they did not rule on that, basically. So we have to see what will happen, if whether or not that will be challenged. And as I understand, election officials in Pennsylvania are keeping those ballots separate, and they will count them, but they will keep them separate just because they're not certain at this point what ultimately may be decided through the courts.
Yeah, the fact that it's not one race but 50 races in the United States, well, 51 if you count the District of Columbia, for people from around the world, it's something that's a little bit difficult to get their head around. So the question is, these accusations of voter suppression, of making it harder or easier to vote depending on which way the pendulum is swinging politically, is it worse than in the past?
Well, let me take the first part of the question. Yes, it definitely is 51, if you will, or even more if we look at the number of counties and jurisdictions across the different 50 states. Because those counties and jurisdictions also have their own ways of conducting elections as long as they comply with the general state guidelines. So it's quite a different a mosaic, as we say, in order to come up with results, especially when they're coming up to one unified election as the presidential election, which is essentially the amalgamation across the states. As to whether it's worse this year in terms of some of this voter suppression, I mean, that's hard to say. I would say that there's the one positive I'm taking from all of this is that, despite some issues you see with the rulings on prison voting and things like that, the one positive is that with the early voting options being expanded in many states, there has been really a better opportunity to cast your ballot early and by mail than there ever has been before. So that's why I do think you will see a record turnout, and I'm hoping by giving voters those opportunities to vote that we will see, participation like we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
Gavin Thompson-Wise of the U.S. Vote Foundation, thank you so much for speaking with us here on France 24.